Vladimir Lenin is one of the most influential people within the global socialist movement. Vladimir Lenin was not a great leader. He banned opposition socialist parties. He turned Soviets in the USSR, Soviets meaning workers' councils, into tools of the ruling party instead of allowing for the Soviets to be independent. And if you look at his new economic policy, it's less socialist and more radical social democracy economically, not like politically social democracy, or market socialism at best. Or you could even call it somewhat state capitalist. But even though Lenin wasn't the best leader the USSR could have had, he was authoritarian, but he was not totalitarian. And the USSR under Lenin is nothing compared to the USSR under Stalin or even modern day North Korea. But Lenin ruled over the USSR only for a short period after the Russian Civil War. Most of Lenin's time in power was from 1917 to 1924, and he only spent 1 year in power after the Civil War, from 1923 to 1924, in which he died in 1924. And Lenin's early death allowed Stalin to take power. Lenin died at the age of 53, but why did he die so early? In August of 1918, Lenin survived an assassination attempt. A woman by the name of Fanny Kaplan tried to kill Lenin after Lenin was walking back after giving a speech at a factory. The reason why Fanny Kaplan tried to kill Lenin is because she believed that Lenin was increasingly becoming more and more authoritarian, which she was right about. Fanny Kaplan believed Lenin was a traitor to the revolution because the Bolsheviks' action to create a one-party state. And to be clear, Fanny Kaplan was an anti-capitalist, and she was a democratic socialist or an agrarian socialist since she was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, an anti-authoritarian socialist party. But to be strongly clear, when I say Fanny Kaplan was a democratic socialist, I don't mean democratic socialist in the sense of Zoran Mamdani or Bernie Sanders. Democratic socialism back then means actual abolishment of capitalism. Just the difference from Lenin is that opposition socialist parties are allowed. So it's like a multi-party democracy and whatnot. But I'm not going to go too much into this because this is kind of off topic. But Fanny Kaplan failed to kill Lenin, and she ended up getting arrested and then sentenced to death by a firing squad. But she caused a lasting impact that would completely change the course of history. After the failed assassination attempt, Lenin actually did get shot twice, but he didn't die. But at the same time, both of the bullets remained inside his body, which bullets are made out of hard metals and stuff, so obviously this led to Lenin having multiple strokes until he actually did pass away. But to be clear, Lenin did not want Stalin to take power after his death. It just kind of worked out that way. But during the very late final years of his life, he realized the mistakes that he had made. But he was close towards death and he couldn't really fix anything. And then after Lenin died, Stalin, who was able to come to power by being an opportunist, completely ruined Lenin's legacy and made socialism and Marxism look horrible for generations upon generations to come. But what if history was different? What if the Bolshevik government arrested Fanny Kaplan before she could attempt to assassinate Lenin? And Lenin ruled the USSR from 1923 to 1950, which, by the way, by 1950, Lenin would have been like 80 years old. By the time he died in 1950, he would have already ruled the USSR for about 27 years. First of all, in this alternate timeline in which Lenin lives a longer life, first of all, Joseph Stalin would have never ruled the USSR. After Lenin died in 1950, Stalin in our timeline died in 1953, There's no way that Stalin could have taken power at the age of 72 and then ruled the USSR for 3 years. What happens to Stalin in this timeline is that he gets removed from major power because Lenin doesn't trust him. So the things that come with Stalin, such as the Great Purge and Stalin's level of cult of personality, does not happen in this timeline. But even though Lenin lives longer in this timeline, dying at the age of 80, the USSR is not a democracy under Lenin. I know that I said that Lenin was less authoritarian than he was, but Lenin still banned opposition parties and made the Soviets tools of the ruling party instead of independent workers' councils. So there's still a one-party rule and censorship and of course the secret police and whatnot. The new economic policy continues for much longer in this timeline. And the new economic policy partially allowed for markets, small businesses, and limited private trade. The USSR develops a more mixed economy. Some famines don't end up happening, and there isn't a agricultural collapse. World War II still happens in this timeline, but the Soviet Union has a better military to fight Nazi Germany. The Soviet military leadership is not devastated by purges, and also the USSR does not solve the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so when Nazi Germany invades Poland, Germany takes all of Poland, but also Hitler might invade the USSR earlier, but also the USSR probably does go through a slightly slower industrialization. Operation Barbarossa still happens, but because the USSR does not sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it happens a few years earlier. But because of the skilled military generals who do not get purged, it is harder for Hitler to invade deep. But at the same time, it's not impossible for Hitler to invade the USSR as deep as in our timeline, because with Lenin, there's slower industrialization, which means the USSR is economically weaker in raw industrial output than in our timeline. But the USSR still defeats Nazi Germany in the end, and after World War II, Europe is still divided between a Western and Eastern bloc, and that includes Berlin. But these governments in Eastern Europe, even though they are friendly towards Moscow, Lenin allows them to be multi-party states, but only socialist parties. The states of the Warsaw Pact are more democratic than in our timeline, and these socialist parties would compete against each other in free and fair elections. Doing this would make socialism globally look a lot different than in our timeline. And in fact, by Lenin doing this, communist or socialist parties in France, Italy, and Greece become more electorally successful. The Cold War would still happen. The United States would still oppose the USSR like in our timeline, but the anti-communist propaganda becomes harder because the USSR in this timeline can point to actual elections, visible political competition, and functioning socialist democracies in Eastern Europe. But to be clear, the people within the Warsaw Pact cannot vote out of socialism, but they can vote for different brands of socialism. And if there's something like nationalist movement which leads a nation to trying to leave the Soviet sphere of Moscow, Moscow still intervenes. Lenin in this timeline dies in 1950, and Nikola Burkin takes power. Because Stalin never took power in this timeline, Nikola Burkin was not executed in 1938. So at the age of 62, Nikola Burkin takes power of the USSR and leads the USSR until his death in 1968. So he leads the USSR for 18 to almost like 20-ish years. I'm assuming that he dies in 1968 since he would turn about like 80 years old in this timeline. So let's talk about Asia. Mao Zedong still rises in China, and the Sino-Soviet split still happens just later than in our timeline. The USSR still occupies North Korea, and Kim Il-sung is still installed as leader, but the Korean War happens later in our timeline. Nikola Burkin does not boycott the UN, unlike Stalin, So when North Korea invades South Korea, he vetoes a resolution at the UN that would send troops to defend South Korea. So the Korean War does happen in our timeline, just that North Korea ends up winning the Korean War, and it's a shorter war. But this does increase Cold War tensions, especially in Asia. But also, North Korea is slightly different in this timeline. It's still a one-party state. It's still a centralized leadership and strong alignment with Moscow. But because North Korea wins the Korean War and the war is shorter, North Korea isn't heavily bombed as in our timeline. And modern North Korea, which controls all of Korea, ends up like modern-day Vietnam or Laos, for an example. Going back to Europe, Nurkurin Burkin ruled the USSR for 18 years, from 1915 to 1968. He dies in this timeline in 1968 at the age of 80. Under Nikolai Burkin, the USSR continues the Leninist-style authoritarianism, and the new economic policy continues. And at this point, it has been going on since 1921 to 1968, so almost like 50 years of the new economic policy. The USSR is still a one-party state, but less terror-based, still politically repressive and Cold War engaged. So Nikolai Burkin dies in 1968 at the age of 80, but instead of one strongman taking power after Nikolai Burkin dies, the USSR becomes under the leadership of a collective leadership of people within like the high ranking of the Communist Party. So think of it kind of like technocracy, if you know what that is. Khrushchev or Brezhnev does not take power in this timeline. Mao Zedong is still in power in China. He rules China until his death in 1976. And by the year 1968, that is when Mao Zedong splits off from the USSR, because Mao Zedong does not support this collective leadership direction that the USSR is going in. But fast forward to 1991, the USSR does not collapse in this timeline, but instead what happens is that the USSR reforms. It reforms into a large democratic socialist state, probably like the largest democratic socialist state in history, larger than, I guess, Chile under Allende. The USSR reforms into a large democratic socialist state by the year 1991. So basically what this means is that in modern 2026, the USSR survives, but it has like, it's a multi-party system. It's not just the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It has like multiple other socialist parties competing in elections. Maybe even like some Menshevik style Marxist parties could like run for, some elections. So free and fair elections in like the Soviet Union. Definitely Vladimir Putin doesn't take power, and the whole like invasion of Ukraine and all that doesn't happen in this timeline. But wow, this recording is almost like 14 minutes. I don't know if the video is going to be 14 minutes. It might be cut down. But wow, it's just kind of insane how one small difference, and that being Fanny Kaplan being arrested early on, leads to this huge alternate timeline and ripple effect. But this is speculative though, but it's possible that someone that we don't know takes power after Nicole Burkin's death, instead of it going to this collective leadership. Or it's possible that Lenin leads the Warsaw Pact nations differently. There's a lot of different... With Lenin living longer and ruling the USSR, it's a lot of different things that could have happened in this timeline. But if you think that, like, I got something wrong, if you think that, like, Lenin would have led the USSR completely different if he had led longer, and that the Cold War would be completely different than in this video, then make sure to let me know down in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and peace.